Well, thank you, Itziri, for that excellent introduction. I'd forgotten about that episode with the Obama White House veterans. I don't know if we would hate each other. We would just argue with each other, probably. But it's great to be here at Davidson. It's really an honor, obviously, to be the inaugural Vann Visiting Professor of Ethics and Society. I want to echo what Mark said, and thank the Vanns for their generous contribution, for the opportunity to be here at Davidson, and creating this role, which I'm honored to be the first one to hold, but obviously I hope to be followed by more distinguished successors. In my visit over the past 2 days, I've really been struck, and this is honest, not just saying something nice to the hosts, by obviously the students are very high quality, and obviously they work hard, and there's a lot of impressive things about Davidson, but particularly by their commitment to, I think, civil discourse, to integrity, to honor. One of the first discussions I had, and the many, many groups of students I've met with, really it's been a pleasure over the last day and a half, was about the honor code, which I knew about vaguely from friends and children of friends of mine who've attended Davidson, but I hadn't really appreciated how central it is to the Davidson experience. And I think you can see the kinds of people who come to Davidson presumably are attracted by that, and the honor code and the general culture and ethos of Davidson then in turn further affects the character and the experience the students have. So it's really been clear to me in the day and a half I've been here. You might say a day and a half isn't that long, but on the other hand, they've been running me around from dawn to dusk, so it's been long enough, but a lot of fun, especially the meeting with the students. Faculty, just kidding. That was a joke. That was a mistake to say that, I think, since I'll have to get along with the faculty in the fall, but they'll forget about this by the fall when I come back to teach my seminar. It really is clear that Davidson is an institution that I think helps shape the lives of its graduates. Certainly friends of mine in Washington who went here felt that, and the moral compass that the Vanns credit Davidson for helping instill in them, I think one sees here on campus as well, and I'm really looking forward to being here, I think once again this term, and then certainly every, teaching a regular seminar in the fall, and doing, I hope, a lot of other things on campus with students and occasionally with faculty. The seminar I'm going to teach, just for your information, it will be called Dilemmas of Ethics and Public Service. And I do want to stress the word dilemmas and maybe just talk about that for a few minutes tonight, because I'm not going to come and tell people, and I wouldn't even dream of it, what the right thing to do is in the different aspects of public service and civic involvement that Americans and others around the world obviously are involved in. I think it's important to really help deepen people's understanding of ethics by discussing the actual tensions, the actual dilemmas that people face. One of the problems with our current discourse is that people very much want, there are times when there is clearly right and wrong, clearly black and white. There are a lot of other times when decisions by governments, politicians, citizens are complicated, and there are considerations on both sides, and I hope I can do my bit to sort of deepen the understanding of that here at Davidson, but it also doesn't mean that there are certain things, as the honor code sort of symbolizes, that really should undergird whatever the difficult decisions are that one has to make. I've also just enjoyed walking around the campus, such a lovely campus and a lot of interesting parts to it. I very much sort of moved actually by the war memorials right near the guest house where I've been staying, which I think are very tasteful and appropriate and impressive, honestly. And again, if one's thinking about public service, one has to think about obviously people who fought and died for the country over the last century or more. Let me talk about ethics in 3 fields, and I'll try to be pretty brief, and we can have hopefully an interesting discussion and interesting comments and questions from you all. I've been trying to think this through in the course of preparing the class, so these are more suggestions or questions almost than some settled doctrine, obviously. So let me divide it into 3 categories or 3 aspects of ethics and public service, public life. Personal ethics, the challenges to individuals, institutional ethics, and then social ethics, the ethics of the sort of society as a whole. Personal ethics. Actually, I had a couple of examples in mind, but one that in the discussion I had this afternoon with the reporter from the Davidsonian, she made asked a very simple question. Often in journalism, simple questions are the best questions, you know, which actually made me think, which was a perfect example of what I wanted to talk about. So I'll just take this example near the end of our 20-25-minute talk. This young lady asked so if I didn't succeed in finding a Republican challenger, but in helping lay the groundwork for a Republican challenger to Trump in 2020, would I consider voting for him again? And I said, no, not really. And she said, would you consider voting for Democrat? And I said, yeah, most of them. I might have qualms about a couple, but I'd want to see who the nominee was. And then the intelligent question then was, well, what do you think about some of your fellow people who really oppose Donald Trump, never Trumpers, but then they say they're not sure they really can vote against him exactly because they have problems with the Democratic Party. My first instinct was to say, I don't quite agree with that, and I think that's maybe they're being a little fastidious, and maybe that's a kind of a cop-out. We discussed that a little bit. But then I thought for another, a few seconds, said, but look, there are legitimate reasons, of course, why one might really think Donald Trump is not a good president and is doing damage to our institutions in various ways, but also, depending on one's views on certain issues, be very hesitant to vote for the candidate of the other party. If one is really pro-life and if that issue is really important to you, you would have to hesitate at least and think through the consequences of voting for a candidate for a party that's going to be pretty hostile, I think you could fairly say, to that point of view. We're certainly not going to give it much weight in terms of everything from judicial appointments to federal funding and so forth. Now, whether that issue is of the same weight, whether one should weigh it that heavily, whether in practice it would make that much difference who the president is, those are all the kinds of questions that I think one would then want to debate. But I think it's a good example where one's initial instinct, my own initial instinct, honestly, is to say, yeah, people really need to bite the bullet here and be willing to desert the party they've been with. One has to hesitate and say, well, different people have different priorities, and some people feel awfully strongly about other issues, and you can't just say that this is obviously the right thing to do necessarily. On the other hand, you can't stop the conversation either, or the discussion, by saying, well, okay, for you, that's an important issue, so you can't vote for a Democrat, but then you would want to say, well, what, practically speaking, would be the implications of, a Democratic president, Democratic Congress? How much would it affect the cause that you believe in so much? Is government action going to make fundamental difference on this issue anyway? I mean, there are a million things one would have to discuss. So I think the ethics people look at sometimes as kind of simple in a weird way. Politics is complicated, but ethics is simple. And there's a certain truth to that, and certainly when you're teaching young children rules of behavior, one wants to be simple. I mean, you say honesty is the best policy. You don't say honesty is usually the best policy. But in the real world, of course, honesty, all these famous examples that moral philosophers have of someone who's crazy or suicidal asks you for a knife, whether you have a knife and you do have one on you, you don't necessarily give him an honest answer and produce something with which he'll do damage to himself. So the complexities of ethics, I think, are really important, and I think one sees them as a voter and as a citizen in the case I just mentioned. I've seen them a lot in Washington, trying to advise friends, especially younger friends, younger colleagues, some pretty recent college graduates, should they go into this administration. So I know a lot of Republicans, obviously, having edited a conservative magazine for over 20 years, having served in 2 Republican administrations. Younger Republicans, get in touch with me, they want advice or whatever, and run ideas by me. And a lot of them in the last couple of years have really been torn. They might have, they've worked on the Hill or they've studied a certain field. They think they can do some good in whatever area they're expert in. It would be exciting, it's fun, it's a great credential if you could work in different departments, but they don't really like Trump much, or they don't approve of him, they disagree with him, and is it appropriate to go in? Some of my friends really have the attitude that you just can't be part of this administration. It's kind of it's inappropriate or wrong, really, to join it. Others of my friends have a much more cavalier, the opposite attitude of, oh, come on, it's, politics, he'll be gone one day, people have to get on with their careers, and if part of your career is becoming a deputy assistant secretary in this department, or number 6 person in the White House communication shop, that's a great credential. No one will remember 10 years from now exactly, who was president necessarily when you had this job, and you'll learn a lot, and you can do some good. I mean, to be fair, you can influence things a little bit in a better direction. I mean, my own answer on this, again, is somewhere in between, that there are times I think many people I respect are in this administration, working in agencies, I think trying to do the right thing for the country, at times trying to stop the president from doing certain things that might hurt the country, they think. And I have no problem with those people being there. In fact, quite the contrary. I've encouraged people, I've introduced people to younger people, to more senior people who were looking for someone to fill jobs. Jim Mattis in the Defense Department, for example. I've sent people to him to try to staff up the Defense Department because one wants to have a strong defense, one wants to have a military that is effective, one also wants to have a military that appropriately responds to the Secretary of Defense and doesn't do illegal things when the president tweets something. If you follow the tweet, you might be breaking the Code of Military Justice or international law or something like that. So it's important to have a strong Secretary of Defense with strong people around him. So I'm a defender of people going into those roles. On the other hand, if you're in government and you're making excuses for things you shouldn't be making excuses for, implementing policies that really are wrong and that you think are wrong, helping to enable further, corruption of democratic norms or just cruelty and other kinds of cruel policies or really damaging policies, one shouldn't go in. So a lot of that becomes a judgment call, I think. And again, they're interesting. That's an ethical dilemma, which I don't think lends itself to a very simple solution. I happen to know General Mattis some. I know General McMaster, who was the National Security Advisor, some, and I was struck. I didn't bother them at all when they were in government. I didn't think it would do them a lot of good to be, hanging around with me. If they, if they had to make some case to President Trump or to other senior people, it's like the last thing they need is someone to say, oh, I saw them together at some restaurant or something. So, not that I'm that well known, but still. So I did, but I've seen both of them since they've left, and I'm not going to, obviously, it's private conversations. But I would say I was very struck by how much these two very, senior military figures, really terrifically impressive people, have struggled with themselves, with their moral obligations as senior public servants, and really balancing having to implement some things they really found distasteful, but being able to stop some things that they thought would do even more damage, and being able to advance some policies that they actually thought were good for the country. And obviously, McMaster ended up being fired by Donald Trump for being too resistant, I think, in a lot of areas. Mattis ended up resigning because of a whole bunch of things, really, not just Syria. The Syria decision that he felt he just couldn't do much good anymore and would end up increasingly being part of an administration he couldn't really defend and policies he didn't want to support. But I think, I don't know if how public they'll be in the next 6 months, but actually, maybe one of them could come to Davidson actually and visit a class. I mean, it really is interesting to talk to people. These are people obviously in their 60s. They've been around. They're, in a way, you'd expect them to be somewhat jaded, military officers. They've seen it all. They're not naifs or they don't have a rosy view of the world, I would say. And they really have grappled with these decisions. And I think it's important to respect people who've grappled with them, learn from them. McMaster, the great irony is, and I'll just say this and conclude this section, when I taught a class at Harvard about 12 years ago, I guess, at the Kennedy School, which was sort of on a somewhat similar topic, but case studies, that's what they do there, case studies in successes and failures of leadership, it was. So, which ethics was obviously a part, but only a part. One of the books I assigned was a book by H.R. McMaster, which I highly recommend. It's kind of long, but detailed, but really fascinating, which was his PhD thesis he wrote in the 90s, I think at Princeton, on Vietnam. It's called Dereliction of Duty. It's a study of Johnson, McNamara, and the chiefs, actually, in this pretty damning study, I've got to say, of all of them, both in terms of political judgment and policy judgment, and also kind of moral failures to stand up and say, at the right time and say certain things that they could have said that might have lessened the damage done by that conflict, but because they had other institutional interests or personal interests or whatever, they didn't quite stand up. I do actually highly recommend this book. It was the best class discussion I've ever had was at the Kennedy School. I was telling someone this afternoon. So that's a graduate school in public policy, so you get graduate students, obviously. A few undergraduates can take the courses. And the Kennedy School has a lot of mid-career military who come to take their, they have a year when they're lieutenant colonels or colonels in most people in most of the services, where they get education. They go to the Navy War College or to other places. Kennedy School is one place they go. And the discussion, the best class I ever taught was on McMaster's book, because there were about a dozen of these military fellows in my course. It's about 75 people. I know that's a huge course for Davidson. You couldn't even imagine such a mob of people in a classroom, but that's how it is at other places. And I just sort of said 2 minutes worth about the book and threw it open to the class, and basically all the military people debated the ethics and the moral dilemmas faced by these various generals mostly, and civilian leaders and people in the White House in 66, 67, 68 over Vietnam. And I said almost nothing, and most of the younger students in the class who didn't have military service were very interested just to listen to these other people who had faced their own dilemmas, obviously, serving in Afghanistan and Iraq and in other places. So it's a real it's a lesson to me that sometimes the best teaching is when you don't talk too much. But really, another lesson, incidentally, that these are not new challenges. I mean, I do think Donald Trump, as its theory sort of suggests, it creates particular problems and challenges. Certainly for me as a Republican, he does. But in principle, a lot of these are not, they're not new. And in fact, there are many historical analogies and comparable situations where people face these kind of ethical dilemmas. So actually, I think it's helpful to get out of the heat of the present to some degree and go back maybe to Vietnam, go back to the pre-Civil War era where Lincoln and the abolitionists clashed on what the right way to try to limit the spread or get rid of slavery was, and many, many instances of this, obviously, in American history and elsewhere. So I think that's a very important field to think through, as I say, both at the level of leaders, Secretary of Defense and sort of big shots in government, at the level of younger people. So what do they do in their careers when they're 30 years old and get offered a job in the State Department or elsewhere in the HHS or elsewhere in the Trump administration, and at the level of actual citizens in terms of voting and volunteering and being active in politics. Institutional ethics. By this I mean, how does one think about the institutions of a society and the ethical obligations one has to them or acting through them? For me, this actually came up with another discussion with students here. Someone said, well, you consider yourself still a Republican. And I said, yeah. I mean, I don't know that I didn't vote for them actually in 2018 because I thought it was important to have a Democratic House at least to check President Trump. But in principle, I would like to save the Republican Party, and I'm proud of a lot of what the Republican Party did over the last 30, 40 years. Made some mistakes as well and all that. But and the students said, yeah, but I mean, don't you think at some point the party almost doesn't deserve to be saved if it gets so corrupted, in this case, in this student's view, and I agree with this to some degree, by a kind of subservience to this president in policies they shouldn't embrace or they shouldn't rationalize. What's the point of saving it? Don't you have to walk away from it? And I have many friends who have resigned from the Republican Party, either on election day and when Trump was nominated, when Trump was elected, and after Charlottesville, and various moments over the last 2 years. I gave an argument that I've given many times actually about how, look, it's healthier for the country over the long term to have two reasonable parties, two healthy parties. You don't really want to just leave the Republican Party, from my point of view, and I mean, this is all from the point of view of someone who's anti-Trump. So if people want to make, obviously people are, in a classroom context, people are free to make other arguments about the substance of these policies and say that I'm wrong about that. But if you're anti-Trump, you don't want to leave you don't want to have the Republican Party just become a sort of Trumpy nativist, somewhat authoritarian, intolerant party. I mean, that would be bad for the country if one of the two major parties goes in that direction. You certainly couldn't guarantee that they would never win an election. You couldn't guarantee, a third at least, 40%, 45%, 53% maybe in the Senate of Congress would be in that party, and it would have real consequences. So even if it's uphill to save the Republican Party, we should try to do it. That's the pitch I've made to donors over the last year, trying to raise money to lay the groundwork for a Republican primary challenge to Trump, and also to do other sort of intra-Republican fights, protecting the Mueller investigation and so forth. And I've sort of I've made this argument a million times, so I made it a millionth and one time. But of course, maybe that's a little too simple as well, because you can rationalize an awful lot of never calling people to consequence if you keep telling yourself, well, we can't let this party just go away, go in a bad direction, so I'm just going to stick with it. But would you stick with it? Someone said to me in 2020, 2021, if they renominate Trump, if they go further down the path of anti-immigrant sentiment and so forth. And those are really fair questions. So even these questions about institutions, I think in general, people would probably agree that it's better to have two healthy political parties in this country than not, but that doesn't automatically answer the question of whether it's right or not right to leave the party, stay in the party, fight within the party, think about shaking up the whole system. Obviously, none of us controls this, and these are just, we just have our individual decisions to make. But it's still, I think, they're still worth pondering and thinking about. I'd say that's very true, incidentally, of leadership of other institutions. One of the biggest lessons for me of the Trump years is that we should be very grateful in America that we have limited government. That's kind of a conservative message, but I think a conservative message that's true, that the president has limited powers, that we have separation of powers. Doesn't always work as well as it might, but it still exists, especially with the courts and with Congress now that the other party controls at least one house. But also we have a federal system, state governments and local governments can do things. We have a huge private sector, civil society, universities and colleges, churches, lots of institutions which don't work for the government, which aren't controlled by the government. Maybe we should actually be more careful about making sure the purse strings aren't controlled by the government in some cases. For me, these last couple of years have been a real re-education in the wisdom of the founders in creating or laying the groundwork really for the creation of this incredibly robust, I think, set of institutions, private and public and nonprofit and secular and religious, and that make it harder for one person, if he's wrong about a bunch of issues or irresponsible or reckless or even demagogic, to really turn us into Venezuela or turn us into Hungary or really do damage to most of these institutions. Now, it's an interesting debate how much damage has been done and hasn't been done, and how solid these institutions are, and how much erosion we can afford. And that's an interesting, more, I suppose, of a political science kind of an historical question. But anyway, I've been very much sort of reminded of how grateful we should be to have this institutional structure. It's nothing we did mostly. It's what our predecessors did. A lot of them didn't really get much credit for it, I suppose, but you now realize how grateful we should be for that. But the leaders of all these institutions have their own ethical questions. Do they cooperate with the government? Do they not cooperate with the government? Does Google help? This is a controversy around the U.S. military. I think that one's actually not that hard, but we could debate that. When they ask for help and AI and machine learning and other things that will lead to more lethal weapons, that will also probably save lives, at least American lives, if we get into a conflict. But obviously there are much more direct questions about businesses, and Syria mentioned DACA and immigration policy, and obviously the way the U.S. works, if you're going to carry out the policies the Trump administration is carrying out, a lot of private businesses and private individuals and government employees have to decide, are they willing to be part of that policy, and maybe they can do it in a more humane way or in a more effective way, or in any way, if they don't do it, someone else will do it, or should they resist? I mean, do universities take on some new obligations and roles in a situation where government policy goes in one direction? So there are a lot of questions about those who are custodians of our institutions, about their own ethical obligations. And I think those are not quite as easy as sometimes they're presented. And it's too easy to say, don't go out, go resist everything. And it's too easy to say, hey, just go on, business as usual. It's not really your business to get in the way or to change what you're doing. And I think it's also a further point that the leaders of institutions have maybe a special responsibility if the leaders of our most prominent institutions, like the presidency, aren't doing what they might be doing in terms of moral leadership. I remember after Charlottesville, I was on TV. There was a panel, I can't remember, CNN or MSNBC, and it was the very familiar discussion already by August of 2017 about, why isn't the president condemning this? The president could do much more. The president's our national leader, our moral leader in times of crisis. I hope he'll step up, someone said. And I was getting a little exasperated, so I said, look, I don't believe he's going to step up. And I don't really even see the point of, at this point, it's fine to hope for it, but it's foolish for the rest of us to paralyze ourselves waiting for something to happen, which is unlikely to happen, would be my judgment. And I remember saying, I said, we have a governor of Virginia, we have a mayor of Charlottesville, we have senators and congressmen, we have pastors and rabbis and imams and priests in and around Charlottesville and in Virginia. We have civic leaders, we have business leaders, plenty of people can step up. Maybe none of them has the impact of the president, but that would make a big difference too. And I think it was actually, I later ran into Governor McAuliffe of Virginia, who weirdly was watching at this moment, or maybe someone told him about it or sent in the clip or something. And he said he actually, he would have done anything. I'm sure I didn't influence his behavior, but I think he appreciated, since he himself was speaking up, the notion that we don't look here in America to one person to sort of speak, for the whole country, and it's easier, obviously, if that person does, but to speak for the whole country at moments of crisis or at other moments. So one's responsibility as a kind of institutional leader is an interesting question. It's a little different from the more personal question of your personal ethical responsibility. And finally, and briefly, and social ethics, societal ethics, let me call it. We have a system here the founders set up very intelligently, checks and balances, faction, checking faction, separation of powers, free market where people compete. We don't rely too much on public spiritedness or on personal virtue here in America. The founders are famously hard-headed. Some people even would say kind of cynical about, or certainly they looked around at history and decided that regimes that had excessive hopes that just people would behave well because they should behave well, those didn't last very long and were easily taken over or weakened. And we needed a more robust structure that dealt with human nature as it is, not human nature as we would wish it to be. Now, I think that is basically a correct understanding of the founders, certainly of Hamilton and Madison, the main authors of the Federalist Papers. But it's, in a way, it's become such a almost cliche that people have gone too far in that direction. And it is worth remembering that the founders also thought you do need some public-spirited citizens who watch out for the whole country, that not everything can just be, ambition, counteracting ambition, and in a big country, factions will check factions, and in a free market, people will compete and you'll get the optimum outcome. They also thought some measure of public spiritedness was necessary. I'll read actually a couple of sentences from Federalist 55. Since I'm here in a college, I feel I have to read some, classical text, I don't get to do this on television very much, I should try this sometime on, MSNBC in the middle of some extremely heated discussion, pull out the Federalist Papers and start reading. Somehow I think that would not work quite as well. Madison says in the end of Federalist 55, he's actually saying, so they're discussing the Senate, the Congress, Senate, and the House, and Madison sort of walks through a series of possible things that could go wrong, and he says, yeah, at some point, if everyone behaves horribly, all these institutional checks that we've built in, 6-year terms for senators, the presidential veto, two bodies that will check each other, representatives from different areas, some representatives from the states, some representing the people, all these checks which are supposed to kind of prevent things from going wrong. If people behave badly enough, of course, things could go wrong. But Madison says, as there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence, Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another. So Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities of a certain degree of virtue in a higher degree than any other form. I think that's why it's so important to think about ethics, to really think about ethics in public life and in public service, not just assume that the kind of system kind of runs itself and no one has to pay attention to thinking about what's good for the whole country, for the whole people, for the future, not just for the present, and so forth. And it brings us back at the end, I think, to the honor code, actually, which is a good example of, I mean, you could presumably at Davidson have various means of proctoring exams and, you know, various ways of trying to ensure that people don't cheat and do things they shouldn't do. But I think there is a real case, not just that it's useful to have an honor code, but that you want to have certain things that elevate people, that remind them that it's not just about getting by as cleverly as you can or doing the minimal things you have to do not to be thrown out of school or whatever, or be caught, but that it is partly about an honorable desire, as Federalist 39 says, to sort of vindicate the claims that mankind is capable of self-government, which is sort of the honor code represents a sense that there is something above mere short-term self-interest. So I'm very much looking forward to trying to put these thoughts more coherently into a syllabus and to discussing them with students here, and really, I will say finally, to discussing them not just in class, but on campus and informal and other groups with students, and to return to my favorite theme, even with professors, when I show up here in the fall. But meanwhile, thank you for your attention tonight. I look forward very much to our discussion here.
At this time, we'd like to invite to the stage 3 members of our faculty. As they say on the award shows, please hold your applause until the end. Dr. Natalie Delia-Deckard, the MacArthur Assistant Professor of Sociology. Dr. Daniel Lehman, Assistant Professor of Philosophy. And Dr. Carol Quillen, President of Davidson College and Professor of History. Please welcome our panel.
All right, well, I'd like to start by picking up on the final thing that Bill talked about, which is civic virtue. One of the civic virtues that's gotten a lot of discussion recently in light of some of the events that also came up in Bill's talk is the virtue of civility. And I want to sort of pitch what I take to be a distinction between sort of a better and a worse conception of civility, and then use that to start off the conversation. So oftentimes I've heard people invoke the value of civility or call on others to be civil, and they seem to mean by civility something like being nice or maybe being appropriate in tone or something of that kind. And I'm not super sold that that's actually that important of a political value, right? But it's a different kind of civility that seems to me to be an extremely important civic value or civic virtue, you might say, and that's treating your fellow citizens, whether ordinary citizens or public servants or what have you, as what we call in philosophy a source of reasons. That is, someone who's offering you reasons that you have to take seriously and to whom you are on the hook to offer reasons. Someone you can't see as an object to be moved, but rather someone to convince or be convinced by. And to bring this out, I've read, I should say, that there's this interaction in the Oval Office between President Trump and Mitch McConnell, right, where Mitch McConnell said in response to President Trump's suggestion that maybe Joe Manchin of West Virginia might be worked with, no, Mr. President, he's a problem, we have to squash him like a grape. right? And my suggestion is that what was uncivil about that wasn't that that McConnell was being mean or nasty so much, that's not great, right? But rather that McConnell was treating Manchin and his possible opposition as a kind of object, right? It's a kind of thing to be moved, or in this case, squashed, right? So I want to start the conversation by making this suggestion and seeing where we can go with that.
It's so rare that I get to defend being nice, you know, that I feel I should. I want to thank Dan for that. You know, I would just say, all things equal, one should be nice, probably, most of the time at least. No, but I think it's a very important distinction. I mean, we're fellow citizens. We're not all friends. There's a certain kind of sentimental rhetoric that sometimes talks about, you know, a nation as sort of a collection of friends. I think that's not realistic, maybe not even desirable. You know, people are quite different. People are entitled to have their own friends and people they don't care for so much. But the key, I agree, is treating people, and you can use a lot of different phrases for this, as, you know, fellow citizens to whom one owes some basic courtesy, I would say, and respect. One form of that courtesy and respect is making real arguments and not demonizing people you disagree with. There are lots of other ways in which citizenship can be, you know, good citizenship can be manifested. But I sort of agree with the point in the sense that I think maybe a little bit too much of the reaction to the hurly-burly and the meanness sometimes even of our politics is sort of more, if only people could be nice, maybe that's a little unrealistic. But it's not unrealistic to expect people to behave in a decent way towards each other. So, I mean, there's a big difference, I guess I'd put it this way, big difference between, you know, the more normal, pretty tough, pretty partisan, sometimes unfair kinds of debates we've had in American politics for a long time, and actually, you know, demeaning personally the person who's on stage with you. That's pretty different from saying, your policies are terrible, they're gonna ruin the country, we're gonna have, you know, no businesses will get started because of your tax rates, or we're gonna weaken our military. I mean, those are, you know, sort of simple-minded, cartoonish versions of more serious arguments, but they're still versions of that, of those arguments. Whereas calling people names is just a way of really, I think, demeaning the public discourse.
I think I'd like to push that a little bit further. And I think that I'd like to really explore the ways in which respectability politics have perhaps been employed to justify what are fundamentally unethical policies that hurt people in real life and in real ways. Bonilla Silva, as a sociologist, I have a tendency to quote, you'll forgive me, will refer to this idea of colorblindness. Right? As long as we're nice, and as long as we're respectful, and as long as we don't attack people personally, then presumably the ramifications of our policies can be considered civil. I really want to question that.
It's a complicated question. Obviously, you can have a civil defense. We've had this in America at times of indefensible institutions. A lot of Southerners, and, you know, were decent people who were slave owners and justified pretty horrible institutions and behavior. Nonetheless, were probably courteous and even gentlemanly, certainly in their dealings with each other. I would say, though, that I take the point. One has to look at these institutions and policies in their own right, not just about what kind of tone of voice they're advanced in. That's very, very true. On the other hand, I would say this, if to the degree that people are, let's say, civil and gentlemanly, they're implicitly acknowledging a standard of behavior that you can then use to hold them to account for. I mean, Martin Luther King made this point a lot. You know, the Declaration of Independence was signed by an awful lot of slaveholders. They were pretty, some of them were somewhat anguished about this, but an awful lot of them were pretty happy not to worry too much about the conflict. And indeed, for the next few decades, you could argue it got worse, not better, in parts of the country at least. But still, the fact that they signed on to that principle, that all men are created equal, had a certain effect and allowed one to say, well, wait a second, maybe you have to, we can debate whether this is true or not, but maybe one has to tolerate some injustices for time being. You don't quite know how to get rid of it, you know, all these excuses kind of for not moving faster. But that still gives us a standard to appeal to. It's an argument Lincoln made effectively and Reverend King made. So I think there's a case, similarly with civility or a certain kind of standard of behavior, I think it does give you some ability to at least push against some of these institutional injustices.
So I think maybe one way to think about Natalie's comment for me, I mean, what it makes me think about is one version of it, let me say it this way, is to think about legality, right? And so one could have a whole set of structures that enabled legal things to be enacted that were clearly and obviously unethical, and one could then make the argument that, well, you know, this is the law, and therefore, you know, it's got some kind of justification, legality masquerading as a justification, right? So I think there's a way in which the real effects of policies are important. And I would make an analogy between that and maybe, Bill, the way that you were talking about ethics, and I can't quote Weber, but I'm going to invoke Weber's Politics as a Vocation, where he makes a really clear distinction between an ethics, a way of thinking about ethics where you adhere to a set of principles absolutely because you believe those principles to be right and virtuous, and an ethics where because you have authority, or in Weber's case, because you are a political person with access to force, you have the ability to use force, where you have to think about the consequences of what you choose to do. So that the consequences, because you talked a lot about consequences, so the consequences, if the consequences of your allegiance to a principle are terrible for whole huge numbers of people, then do you violate the principle that matters to you? Take pacifism. Do you violate that principle in the interest of preventing these terrible consequences, or do you stick to the principle? And Weber's point was, if you want to be in politics, you can't be like someone who adheres to principles no matter what. You have an ethical obligation to think about the consequences of what you choose to do, even when a good principle is motivating you. I didn't say that as eloquently as Weber, but I think that's what you were saying, right? That there are consequences to political decisions that go beyond one's own moral purity, and that those consequences matter. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. Like, policies have consequences that affect real people, and the respectability of their mode of implementation is less important than their effects.
Yes. After saying yes, I want to make it a little bit more complicated, and I want to make it a little bit more real. I hear the conversation around Donald Trump as president and as the short-fingered vulgarian. And I hear the ways in which the abject vulgarity is used to make real problems that have existed for my entire adult life. And I see the ways that I'm going to call it abject vulgarity again, brings into our national consciousness ways of marginalization that we have been talking about for decades, and brings people to a point where they're like, no, we can't do this anymore. And coming from a history in which the politics of respectability have been used to silence, right, me, my communities, I find it difficult to make that vulgarity in and of itself the incivility and the lack of ethics.
Yeah, to the point of vulgarity, I have a friend at a different college who described the attitude of some self-proclaimed liberal Democrats to the support that many working class Americans have given to Trump, along the lines of, well, look, democracy is awesome, but these people are peasants, right? Which you sometimes, unfortunately, you hear, right? And there's something deeply, deeply troubling, right, about the sort of alignment of the criticism of Trump and his very real and sort of genuinely substantively immoral behavior, right, with a kind of cultural lowness, right, that allows us to make the kind of moves that I think Natalie is worried about.
Yeah, no, I've never liked the vulgarity critique of Trump very much for that reason. It's a distraction, and it's not the fundamental problem. Now, if it wakes people up to things that they were otherwise papered over by as you say, some kind of culture of civility, or that's fine, I suppose, and maybe useful in some ways, and I think that's probably happened to some degree. I would still defend, I think it's not, I still would say that a civilization, a country that values a certain level of courtesy, civility, respectability, if you want to call it that, can be utterly hypocritical. It can paper over a lot of things. Legality obviously can be used in very bad ways. Though I don't think it's it's not an accident. I mean, I love the Weber essay, and it's been a long time since I read Weber himself, but also other thinkers like that. It's not an accident that at the beginning in the 30s, when Hitler took power, the most famous jurists in Germany did not say, well, everything is legal, and we're going according to the law, and that's great. There was some of that, and the Nazis were sort of interested, and I mean, not to get to the Nazi analogy right away, but still it's interesting. They were interested in a certain kind of pro forma simulacrum of legality. But the most famous thinkers of the time, Kelsen and Carl Schmitt and these characters, will actually believe the law is what the Führer says it is, and you have to get over that old-fashioned belief in due process and trials and bureaucracy and all these kind of boring things that were characteristic of liberal democracy. So I'm more willing to defend the boring things that are characteristic of liberal democracy. Now, the great thing about in America, the legality is supposed to be somewhat anchored in broader or deeper principles. If you open the U.S. Code, the actual first thing in the U.S. Code is the Declaration of Independence. And I think that and Lincoln very famously in the Gettysburg Address began 7 years ago, which, if you do the math, from 1863 takes you back to 1776, not to 1789, because he really understood, or 1787, because he understood that you need to ground the legality or the constitutionality in more fundamental principles. So having said that, I mean, I very much take the point that you can mislead yourself or fool yourself or fool others with a kind of surface legality or failure to consider consequences. The Weber essay is really, I highly recommend it. The Politics is a Vocation, which I think he gave, it was a talk he gave, and it must have been almost exactly, but within a year or two, I'm going to say 100 years ago, because I think he gave it after Germany's defeat in World War I, and it's really a wonderful consideration of the question of, and he does justice to the ethics of intent, the ethics of consequence, which you described, and what's the other one? I guess the ethics of intention or something like that. I mean, sort of, purity, pure spirit, or whatever, good intentions. And he does justice to that. There's something very admirable about good intentions. But at the end of the day, it's not enough, certainly in public life and in politics. Maybe in private life, it would be a somewhat different situation.
To draw together the threads of legality and virtue we've been talking about, you might draw a distinction between legality and the rule of law, right? And you might think that the rule of law is a somewhat more demanding sort of thing than just sheer legality. And you might plausibly think, and many theorists of law do think, that rule of law has a characteristic ethos, right? A characteristic sort of mode of public regard and engagement. And if that's the case, then we might need some of that to get beyond mere legality, which also regrettably may be in danger as well. And you got to make sure we take care of that. But rule of law might require even more.
In thinking just about the points that I think we're all trying to make here about there seems to be this question of I think Natalie, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of what you're asking is, like, what has enabled us to see structures that inequitable or unethical structures that have existed for a long time, to which we have been blind for a very long time, right? Is that partly what you're saying? And is this, what is it about this moment that's allowing us to see those things? And what is the intellectual or ethical talent that enables that? In other words, what is it, because this is one of the things that I think colleges and universities are good at doing, is helping people get under assumptions that are hard to see because we so take for granted that they're true. So if there's a way that we can, if there's a way that we can understand what it means to learn as being willing and able to question what everybody already knows is true, and being able to see in those questions other alternatives than the one we've always known, that's the way we're able to produce knowledge that hasn't already been learned by someone else before. And I think that is kind of the process that you see happening now, right? That the gloves are off, all kinds of horrific things are being said, and in their saying, we're looking at the realities of the world that we were able to ignore before, that were not in our brains before.
I'm so happy that you went first, because I was hoping that you would speak to this idea of where the belief in rule of law was getting us in terms of our responsibility as educators. We're here at Davidson College, and we're planning a class. Ultimately, what does all of this mean? I think that the current moment, and I'm not sure how Bill feels about this, is forcing us to reckon with what the rule of law means. We're asking daily how strong our institutions are and how much they can take. And this is causing us, I think, to really question some of our underlying assumptions about why we would want these institutions to endure and what type of law we hope to see. And I welcome those questions. Yesterday's topic of the day was, can you have a society in which you have billionaires, and can that be ethical? In a world where I could go on. Right? I cannot imagine that conversation happening in the Obama administration, which was so civil, so scandal-free. I don't know how to reconcile these questions with the idea that civility, social norms, and ethics go together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that having a huge amount of disruption stimulates debate, and often actually in, Carol would know more about this than I would, in history, I think you could argue some of the most fruitful times in philosophy and literature, and other times were in crises and in challenges posed to various orders, and which, as you say, caused a kind of rethinking and exposing of hitherto unchallenged assumptions. I'm not so sure how unchallenged these assumptions were, before Donald Trump became president, or how much people didn't debate them. And it may just be that people concluded, and I myself would even share this conclusion, that if there's upward social mobility, if poverty is being reduced radically around the world, as it has been for the last 30 years, due basically to I would argue, a reasonably free trade, free market regime growing up and being defended by us and exported in a way to India and China and other places, for all of its problems and deficiencies and things that should be fixed. Maybe that on net is a good ethical trade-off. And if you have to have a few billionaires who, if it's too complicated to figure out how to set up, maybe it isn't too complicated, but if it is too complicated to figure out how to tax them in ways that prevent them from becoming billionaires, but without stifling actual economic growth or ambition, maybe a few billionaires is a price worth paying for a society. And maybe some of them can do some good the government can't do. So Bill Gates can actually reduce malaria and other diseases in Africa in a way that I'm not sure government would have been able to do, actually. So those are complicated questions, and I'm not a dogmatic on sort of the current distribution of wealth, God knows, and it probably has gotten more unequal. And a lot of these do require actual empirical discussions. I guess that would be the one point I would make, and I think this follows from the point about consequences. Consequences have to be real consequences. And so one has to talk about, in the real world, how to have different policies worked out. Obviously, there's a kind of cartoonish conservative critique of, which says socialism equals Venezuela. It's horrible, and so we can't ever have more redistributive policies. That's ridiculous. Socialism could also equal Sweden, presumably, or Norway, or other places. On the other hand, there's a non-cartoonish conservative point that economic growth really is good for people, including a lot of poor people. And if you want economic growth, there's some empirical evidence that you want an awful lot of incentives for people to make money, and maybe you want to limit the extent to which government manages the economy and so forth. So, these are partly empirical arguments, and I think the same would be true of the trade-offs in some respects between criminal justice and policing and so forth. So I'm a little uncomfortable with or at least I think it's a question. One shouldn't reject a previous kind of complacency in order to then jump into a new kind of And so now we all agree on X because we probably don't really all agree on X, and that's fine. I mean, we need to have an actual debate about the politics and the morality of various policies, of various institutions, the real world consequences of them, the real world alternatives to them. Because simply saying, as everyone up here knows, and as you all know, simply saying something is unpleasant or unattractive or even somewhat unjust doesn't really prove that the replacement will be more pleasant or more attractive or more just. So I think being pretty hard-headed in the spirit of the founders about some of the actual choices we face is also part of having a serious ethical discussion.
I'm interested to know what you're alluding a lot to a difference between what happens in the academy, what happens in pursuits of the mind, and what happens in real life or the real world, right? These ideas about hard-headedness and what needs to happen. I'm wondering if you can flesh that supposed distinction out in greater detail.
Probably in the fall I'll be able to, you know. That's right. No, I mean, look, I don't think there's that much. I kind of agree with you I think if we're saying that at the end of the day, I don't think the standards of the academy should be different from the standards of the, quote, real world. Arguments are either good arguments or bad arguments, or have evidence or don't have evidence, and it doesn't really matter whether they're, in a funny way, whether they're made by a professor in a classroom or a student in a classroom or by a politician on the stump. I mean, at the end of the day, one has certain tolerance for different types of discourse, obviously, in different places, different expectations for detail and carefulness and so forth. But, you know, basically, I think it's one big discussion and one big argument. So I'm not an advocate of the academy being, you know, wildly separating itself from society, or society, which would be very bad, I think, separating itself from the academy. But, you know, I would say there are plenty of examples in the history of philosophy, let's say, to take something Dan knows a lot about, I mean, and Carol, actually, all of you do, that, you know, of extremely hard-headed philosophers. It's not like, you know, John Locke was some kind of, you know, wistful guy who had these dreams of what could be, and he had a pretty hard-headed understanding, I think, of how a liberal society might exist and how a market, kind of proto-or Adam Smith, let's just say, how a market economy might exist, and also its flaws and its limitations. So I am very much in favor of, I personally come out of a tradition of reading some of these thinkers and taking them very seriously, and I think our public life would be better informed if more people took them seriously. I also think our academic life would be benefited by, obviously, taking the kind of lessons of history and of empirical studies and social science and everywhere else seriously as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important for us to think about as we have these debates is what exactly do we think should be sort of the right approach to using empirical data in arguing about these highly normative topics. There's a kind of method of argument that you see on the news a lot that I call the data dump, right? And this is the worst on the left, right? So people will go on MSNBC and just drop this barrage of data, like I have all the data, like I can give you more data, like just all the data, as though the data will somehow just speak for itself, as though the data will interpret itself, right? But data doesn't normatively interpret itself, right? We have to come up with some kinds of explicitly moralized arguments to make sense of the data. So I think one thing we need to think about when being hard-headed, as it were, that is caring about the empirics, as of course we have to do. Otherwise, we're not going to make contact with reality in an adequate way. We have to also, I think, be very conscious that the empirical reality doesn't sort of give a normative account of itself. We as citizens have to do that, and we have to do it explicitly, right, without sort of pretending to fall back on data as though it does all the work.
I'm going to invoke moderator's prerogative and open up for questions. There are microphones on the floor. We're asking only Davidson students, please, but we'd like you to come forward and ask questions and to round out the last part of our program. Jonathan?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Carol intimidated everyone by mentioning Max Weber, so no one's willing to ask a question now. You know.
So this is from a class I took with Dr. Sika, the political psychology class. And so I have a question about how do you think like the unrealistic expectations we place on politicians contribute to like problems of ethics in society. For example, we want politicians to be exceptional, like smart, have integrity, but we also want them to like understand problems of the ordinary American, like driving a pickup truck, going bowling, etc.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, do we really place that unrealistic expectations on politicians? I would say Americans, the American tradition, has a certain smart alecky and cynical view of politicians, actually, which is well justified often. Though I think not always. I mean, I would say, generally speaking, having been in Washington all these years, the one thing, I probably am a little less cynical about most politicians' motives than I was before coming to Washington, because you study the academic literature, at least this was the case back when I was an assistant professor, and you know it's all self-interest and who can get you reelected and who your biggest donors are, and obviously there's a lot of truth to that. But, and everything is performance, and you know, as you say, showing up at the, looking like a man of the people and stuff, and there is obviously a lot of that. But there are an awful lot of people who go into public life for good motives. Some of them get corrupted as they stay or sort of forget why they went into it, but others not. And if you expand the scope from politicians, which if you're thinking of elected politicians, to public officials, of whom there are, you know, obviously many, many more, and if you expand the scope from the federal government to state and local governments, I think one finds some, as Madison put it in Federalist 55, some grounds for hope, as well as some grounds for concern. I do think it's interesting to look at, and this is more of a political science question, your state and local governments today. So we have hyperpolarization at the federal level. We have, you know, some of us would say, a president who's not a terribly good leader for the country and so forth, and maybe congressional leaders we're not crazy about and all that. But actually, I don't know, are states being governed less well than they used to be? Are cities? I think you can make a pretty strong case that actually an awful lot of cities are being governed in a pretty impressive way, combining, you know, hard-headed, if you want to use this, emphasis on economic growth and pro-business policies and so forth, with attention to, some attempts at least, to attend more than in the past to equity, to justice, to fairness for all groups and for all citizens, and so forth. So I think thinking about the ways in which, and I think this is a good thing about America in a way, that it's not all or nothing on the federal government. And maybe there's more hope, and maybe more hope for the society too. I mean, if we're so polarized, how come people in an awful lot of cities don't seem to be bitterly opposed to each other and seem to elect, you know, mayors with pretty big majorities often, and those cities seem to develop in pretty impressive ways. So states a little more complicated, but not untrue about states either. And then, of course, non-governmental associations, civic associations, not-for-profit associations, an awful lot going on in that space. So I think that would broaden maybe the elected officials are always going to have to win elections, which leads them in a certain direction, but there are an awful lot more public officials than elected officials.
Over here, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Matthew Labar. I'm a senior here at Davidson and a philosophy and math major. I wanted to ask about civility because I think you're concerned about the ways that our failures to be civil to each other can hyperpolarize us and make it difficult to kind of bring about effective policy and make us kind of unjustifiably like hate each other. And I'm curious what you would say to kind of concerns that we might take civility too seriously in a way that blinds us, as Dr. Delia Deckard was talking about, to really deeply harmful policy when people can kind of mask intentionally or unintentionally, for example, deeply racist policy in the language of law and order and other issues like that. How are we supposed to be civil to our opponents in light of those concerns?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's also a good question. I mean, I look, at different times, I would be on the side, in a different circumstance, I would be, and have been actually, on the side of disrupting things, of exposing things, of not papering over differences, of being honest about certain institutions. We might all have our own differences then about where that goes in terms of substance of policies. So I'm not, you know, I would never say more civility the better, no matter all circumstances. There are times when you want to be uncivil. There are times you want to practice civil disobedience, which could be done, maybe still could be done with a little more civility than less. and more effectively if done with a little more civility than less. But civil disobedience is very different from civil acquiescence. So I don't think at the current moment the problem, however, is too much civility. And I do think there really is some basic, certainly for politicians, I mean, and in Washington, it's one thing, citizen activists, that's a different role. I have no problem with people being quite outspoken, vociferous, uncivil if they see something really horrible. But I mean, I guess I'd say the civil rights movement is a pretty impressive example of this. I mean, John Lewis was extremely outraged as a civil rights leader. He was treated horribly, obviously, beaten up, and jailed, but still had a certain dignity and a certain basic civility, which I think helped make his case more effectively than if he hadn't been. But there are times when I wouldn't be civil either, and there are times in history, God knows, and in the 20th century when total lack of civility was justified by the policies of the government or of others who were in charge or trying to execute really horrible schemes. Again, though, I'd say right now, in our big democracy, you do need some basic civility, I think, just to function, and I think that is the absence of it is more of a problem than too much sort of papering over of differences at this time.
I want to add something off of that question that I hope will be helpful to sort of the audience at large. To the degree that bodies are political, my life is much less comfortable than it was 3 years ago. It is just less civil out there. Right? The things that are said and the ways that we treat one another, and I'm saying that more broader than perhaps I intended. I am less comfortable, but I should have been less comfortable during other times in American history where things were far more civil and people were far less likely to act out, but which, frankly, more horrible things were happening. That, to me, is a critical distinction.
I think I would also try to recall Dan's distinction between different kinds of civility. So if by civility we mean nice or polite or that is not the political virtue of civility that Dan was trying to name. The political virtue of civility, which perhaps is an ethical virtue of being a human person, is that we engage with other human persons as entities giving us reasons. And there are times when that's not what's happening, and one doesn't feel like, I often feel like I am not being spoken to as if I'm a brain with reasons to give or a being with reasons to give. I'm being labeled, or I'm being dismissed, or I'm being silenced by an epithet, right? I don't wish to treat other people like that. I don't think treating other people like that back is politically effective. I don't think it's politically effective, and I don't think it's ethical. So those, I think that's the distinction that we're trying to make, and it's hard because it's difficult to be silenced by an epithet. It's awful, and one wants to, react. I think it's both politically more effective, and we're rising to the person we could be when we don't do that. Now, obviously, I have all kinds of privilege right now that make it easier for me to do that than lots of other people, and I recognize that.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Bristol Richards. I'm a senior political science major here, and I wanted to ask kind of about Dr. Lehman's definition or proposition that to be civil, you need to acknowledge other people as reason givers alongside yourself, because my interpretation of all of this is that ethics is a really powerful model for understanding our basic impulses, that some things are good or bad. And sometimes we revise that model, or we stick to that model, or we abandon the model entirely. Sometimes you add to the model that revolution is appropriate given some sufficient degree of injustice around you, or maybe not revolution, but civil disobedience or civil acquiescence, somewhere along these degrees. And I feel like all of this depends on a model where everyone has free information, and total ability to interact with each other in these discursive ways that, to me, ignores the power dynamics and the exclusive institutions that where these conversations really take place, whether it be in a very elite academic institution that Davidson is, or even in our government. And so I want to ask about this failure of ethics or a possible failure of ethics to internalize the power imbalances between these people who all want to come together and give reasons to each other when sometimes they can't.
Yeah, so that's a great question. In my own view, I think that civility of the kind I've recognized as the more important kind depends for its existence on certain kind of structural features of societies and not just personal features of individual persons, right? And I think that, although it sounds odd to say it, it has a weird ring to it, I think that civility can be impossible when certain degrees of structural power are in place, right? It can be the case that I cannot relate civilly to someone, right, if there aren't structures that make it possible for us to regard each other in a way that the theorist Philip Pettit calls passing the eyeball test, right? I have to be able to look everyone else in the eye, and they have to look me in the eye. And if we can't, we're not going to be able to see each other equally as reasons givers. And that's not always just up to us sort of volitionally, right? I can't just opt for that to be the case, or that's the case might be a structural matter. So I'm inclined to think that structures of power absolutely make a difference and can undermine the virtue that I'm calling civility.
I would just say, like, one of the things that I think Natalie is saying is that we can now see those structures that make that kind of, this is what I take from what she's saying, is that we can now see those structures in a way we couldn't before and are more moved to dismantle them to make the world we want to live in possible, to create the preconditions for the kind of relations we want to have with others that are not possible now in certain contexts.
And I guess I think civility is a little bit, maybe a funny term. We're now stretched it so much that I'm not sure. And it has these connotations of niceness, which I don't think I mentioned, and which Dan explicitly attacked. So, but let's just call it giving reasons, as Carol said. I would make the opposite argument. Forcing people to give reasons undermines structures of power, because if you force people to give reasons, you are treating them as equal agents, and you are implicitly suggesting, at least, that if reasons are given that would undermine or challenge the current structures of power or of anything else, one would be open to change them. Otherwise, one wouldn't bother giving reasons. There's a reason why totalitarian regimes aren't really interested in having big public debates where everyone gives reasons. So I think it's too easy, honestly, to say this is a privileged institution and behind closed doors people say different things than they do publicly. It's extremely important that you have public spheres where people have arguments because other people hear them. Now, does everyone hear discursive discourse, and is everyone not moved by just old-fashioned prejudice or opinion or limited knowledge? Of course not. But the only way to break that down a little bit is by, the only peaceful way, at least I would say, to break that down is by giving reasons. There are times when you have to go beyond a peaceful way, though even then, I think one should and has to give reasons, both practically speaking. You need more people to agree with you. I mean, the Declaration gave reasons, right? All those lists of charges, some of them a little bit inflated or exaggerated, honestly, but they needed, actually a majority of the colonists to go along with a risky revolution. They also wanted to appeal, as the Declaration says, to the opinions of mankind, or really of other countries, to get some help, which meant it had to look reasonable what they were doing. So I would be a little more favorable to the appeal to reason as having its own force in politics, and mostly a good force. Of course, people can make up disingenuous arguments and so forth, but and a little less, concerned that that's merely a facade which prevents a searching examination of the existing power structure.
Over here.
William Bochway, senior, sociology and Africana studies major. So I do want to question something that you mentioned earlier about trading in a little bit of injustice to make the world a better place in general for everyone. I do want to question by what measures you claim that the world has become less poor over the last few years. And I say that because as someone who's looked at the increasing wealth gap between people, I want to know who is being referred to with that statement, and also when you look at who controls the power within these free market structures, who actually is benefiting from it, who is free under this free market, and who is being studied when you, and like referred to when you mention that we all have become better in recent years, because I'm not totally convinced by that. Also, a self-serving side comment is that the civil rights movement doesn't work without incivility. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's true about the civil rights movement to some degree. It also it would be different in different countries, obviously, and South Africa is not the U.S., and one has to not be, I'm not for mindless civility, to come back to that word, or niceness, or pulling of punches, or failing to be militant in many causes. There's very interesting debates, and not just among African Americans here, but in many communities and throughout history, obviously, about militancy and including violence, as opposed to more polite and or more law-abiding, let's say, ways of trying to rectify injustices. I mean, I wasn't making some fancy. I mean, you point about America. I was just making a simple-minded point that in the world, like 7 billion person world, it's no one really questions, I don't believe, that over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a massive decline in real poverty. I mean, real horrible poverty, a big increase in life expectancy, a big increase in decrease in infant mortality, especially in the two largest countries in the world, China and India, and that matters. Now, we can argue about the reasons for that, and we can say the U.S. shouldn't get much credit, or the liberal world order that the U.S. upholds shouldn't get much credit for that. I would make the case that it probably does deserve a fair amount of credit. But I wasn't making a point about American distribution of wealth. I think that is more problematic and questionable about how much progress has been made here in various ways. But I was just making a much more simple point, honestly, about the world as a whole. So, in terms of, I didn't mean to say that, it sounds too Machiavellian, or not even Machiavellian, too simple to say, well, we should tolerate this injustice for the sake of the greater good. I don't actually quite believe that. That would be a certain philosophical point of view, I guess, but not one I'm actually very friendly to. I simply meant to make, again, the more simple point that I don't believe there'll ever be a regime, a republic, a nation, society without some injustices. And obviously that doesn't justify not seeking to remove them and not removing a lot of them and not improving. I do think there's a danger in a kind of utopianism, though, that says, and this is sort of your version of what Dan was talking about, sort of pointing to a lot of facts. I mean, there's an injustice, and therefore what? I mean, let's think through then how we change that injustice. Plato's Republic, Plato argues, or seems to argue in the Republic, that obviously it's unjust, and it is in some ways, for people to grow up in different families where they have wildly different opportunities based on different parents with different educational levels, different incomes, different privileges, and therefore we should have the common raising of all children in common, and everyone has exactly the same treatment, but really that's done as a kind of not as a serious proposal, but rather as a demonstration of how far one would have to go to remove all injustices, given the way human beings are. That doesn't mean that one couldn't challenge the traditional family. It doesn't mean one couldn't have be in favor of a zillion social programs that would try to correct or cut against the current distribution of wealth and power. I'm not saying that at all, but I think there's some danger in not realizing that there are also dangers to a kind of utopianism, which thinks that we can have a world that is where there aren't trade-offs, I guess the way I put it, and where removing one injustice can create another one.
I really want to tack on to that. Some of the conversations that are coming out of Davos right now, deeply contentious. Are we getting richer or poor as a global society? It's tremendously controversial and tremendously important to be critical about the ways in which we understand economic growth under free market capitalism, and it's being argued as we speak in Switzerland. So I think that that's worth sort of tuning into, just to present another point of view on that really good question.
So final tiny thought on that. One thing I think that we need to ask ourselves is not just are we getting richer, right? But are we getting richer in a way that makes us relate to each other in a way we're satisfied with, right? Because those answers can come apart. Now, how do you answer that? That's going to take a lot of, detailed argumentation, but it could be entirely possible that we are getting richer, even massively richer. I don't know if we are, I'll leave that to one side, but still not relate to each other in a way that we think answers to the demands of equality. So I would just note that those issues can come apart.
I will just take those points, but I do want to say, a massive reduction in infant mortality, I'm going to be kind of simple-minded here and say that that's a good thing and something that we should be proud of and something that we should value, and not having major world wars for 50, 60, 70 years and having, more than I would wish, instances of ethnic cleansing and genocide, but nothing like what we had in the first half of the 20th century. That's also a good thing. So one has to then say, well, what, is that just inevitable? Is that just like, the world was set up in a way that from 1900 to 1950, there'd be massive slaughter, and then from 1950 to 2020, there'd be much less. And incidentally, as I say, infant mortality would decrease radically, and life expectancy would increase radically, and so forth, or not. And if you think that that wasn't somehow just baked in the cake, you do need to then have a discussion about certain public policies, certain world structures, certain structures of wealth and privilege even, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean you can't say that everything should be changed and much changed for the better. But that was the only kind of fairly simple point I was making.
Let's go over to this side.
Hunter Calloway. I'm a freshman, and there's a lot of talk earlier about hard-headedness and the necessity for politicians to sometimes divorce themselves from principles to be more effective. How can you draw a distinction between politicians being pragmatic to be more effective as a means to an end versus those being pragmatic or cynical to avoid taking a moral stand on any issue?
So I would say they don't divorce themselves from principle, but they have a different judgment sometimes. Lincoln had a different judgment from Garrison and so forth, and to some degree from Frederick Douglass, though Frederick Douglass would change his mind a little bit about this later on, reflecting on Lincoln, about the right mix of, absolutely militant and principled opposition and insisting on the immediate, if possible, removal of slavery, as opposed to Lincoln's position, which at least formally was, stopping the spread of slavery and then acting to put it in the path, I think he called it, of ultimate extinction. Now, that's a legitimate debate. Lincoln could, Lincoln's a famous person, greatest American president perhaps, so we all, one wants to one's instinct is to say, well, maybe Lincoln was right, maybe not, though, But, so the distinction would be, is the politician or anyone else authentically at least trying to advance in the right direction? Maybe he's misjudging what can be accomplished or the cost of not moving faster and so forth. Or is the politician just not even interested in rectifying injustices and moving in the right direction and so forth? Now that's itself a judgment call, obviously, but life is full of such judgment calls. But why was Lincoln so opposed to Stephen Douglas, to take one of the few areas of American history I sort of remember from my academic days, having taught it a few times? It was Douglas. Douglas himself personally was not pro-slavery and was a decent man, a civil man actually, I think maybe honestly thought his policy of saying the federal government didn't care about slavery would actually ultimately still lead to the reduction of slavery, the removal of it, technology might take care of it, and so forth. Lincoln balked at Douglas so fiercely and was willing to really risk a civil war by resisting Douglas and denouncing Douglas and, in a sense, expelling Douglas almost or from the anti-slavery movement, because he thought once you say you don't care, which was Douglas's way of keeping the South kind of on board, you've given up the fundamental moral guidance that has to guide you in dealing with this issue and in dealing more broadly with the issues of equality in a democratic republic. So I think it's not throwing out principle, it's different judgments about speed and means to achieve common principles. There also are conflicts over principle, obviously, and that's a slightly different matter.
Can I just give one quick example of that? because it just the way that you phrased that question just really reminded me of this. So when I was at Princeton in the mid '80s was the height of the divestment from companies that do business in South Africa, and I think I remain, but I was deeply convinced that it was really important for us to take a stand that Princeton should, we had a list of companies, that Princeton should divest from these companies who were sustaining apartheid in South Africa. That was my position. The moral position was apartheid is horrible. We can't be implicated in its perpetuation. And it wasn't until I engaged, I was a student, but because the people that were on the board of trustees there who disagreed with that position were willing to talk to me and say, look, we agree, this one man, I agree apartheid is terrible. We want it to be dismantled. I disagree that your way of going about it and the thing that you're asking for is the fastest way to do that. I didn't doubt, there were people that didn't care. I didn't doubt that this person cared. But I was then able to see, I didn't agree with him, but that he had another way of getting there. Does that make sense? And then there were people that were like, we don't care. It's not our job. We don't care. Shouldn't think about it. This is irrelevant. Shouldn't be a university. Shouldn't talk about this stuff. And there was a big difference to me at that time. If that makes sense.
Hi, my name is Claire Brantley. I am a sophomore double major in music and global public policy. I have a couple different questions. I first want to problematize the usage of romanticizing and almost fetishizing the Constitution in a way that fails to acknowledge the usage of all men are created equal and that flexibility of that statement being recontextualized time and time again to include who the people in power choose to include within that statement. So including women, people of color, and people of trans rights. And so I think it's doing ourselves a disservice when we take ourselves out and say, well, the Founding Fathers said all men are created equal, without acknowledging the positionality of the Founding Fathers and their intentions in writing this and who was to benefit. Dr. Deckard, I think you touched on this a little bit with your statement, but you said something about these issues have been around for a while, and suddenly now we're having this discussion. Do you think that's because now people who, using race as a social construct, people who are white find that their identity is under threat? And can you speak more to the moral and ethical ramifications of not acknowledging the positionality of those who write the law and who the law is to benefit?
Thank you. I think that I want to address that almost back to front. Can we make explicit that, and actually this speaks to a question that came up before, where a student asked, I'm not going to do this correctly, what is the position of politicians who are essentially chosen because they might be fun to bowl with? And this was treated in one way, but there's another way of looking at that question, and it intersects. It's how much do we expect to see ourselves reflected in our representatives? How do we proxy that, and what does it really mean? I'm gonna make the argument that only one person in America wants to bowl with the president. But people do care, and their right to care. The degree to which their lives, their needs, their claims making is reflected in the people who are supposed to represent them. That's not currently the case. And there's a huge disparity in terms of parties. What diversity is represented? Who sees themselves in Democrats? Who sees themselves in Republicans? When we talk about the party of law and order, and we talk about the party in which there are very few people of color, very few members of the LGBT community, relatively few women, how can we have those conversations in isolation? One has something to do with the other. To what extent does law just reflect the positionality of the law and order party? I think that's a really important question. Now I've forgotten the other bits, but I think I'm going to let Mr. Kristol speak on that. Thank you.
I mean, so it's a question on the founders. I mean, maybe I am romanticizing them on that. I don't believe they most of them, certainly Jefferson, did not, he knew what all men are created equal meant, and he meant that all human beings are created equal with certain fundamental rights. Now, we can argue whether his view of those rights was expansive enough. He understood perfectly well that in America at that time, many people didn't have the ability to exercise those rights. He was, in my view, much too complacent about the amount of time it would take, certainly in the case of slavery, to get rid of it. Hamilton was much more impressive in that way, for example, and Adams, and John Quincy Adams was actually quite important in the anti-slavery effort. But because the principles of the Declaration were laid out, I think it's a mistake to say that the principle themselves, this is what Roger Taney said in Dred Scott, but I think he's just wrong as a historical matter, that the founders thought all men are created equal meant simply all white men living in the 13 colonies at the time. It was supposed to be an abstract principle that could lead the country in a direction that I think most of the founders, almost all of them really, thought was the right direction. Maybe they didn't have imagination about every class, sufficient imagination about how to vindicate those rights or the scope of those rights. Obviously, things have changed a lot since then. But I don't believe it's fair to say that somehow they really did it. I don't know, I'm happy to problematize everything, but I would also say that in this case, but also, there really is a record of what they thought about these issues. My only caution on, it's all, I'm not going to defend the white working class supporters of Donald Trump, or any supporters of Donald Trump particularly. On the other hand, I will say, as this is not my formulation, or someone else's, that the white working class having spent 30 or 40 years being lectured to in the language of identity politics and being told that everyone else had a right to have their interests, anxieties, grievances, many of them legitimate, obviously, respected, attended to, taken seriously, decided, okay, fine, if we'll just have our own identity politics. And it turned out that white working class identity politics, there's a lot of people in the white working class, and once they decided to play identity politics, they were happy to vote for someone who appealed to them, I think in bad ways, demagogic ways often, in terms of their anxieties and grievances, and some of those anxieties obviously are very legitimate and real in terms of economic stagnation and automation and displacement and so forth. Some of them I think are much less attractive anxieties about the changing character of the society, race, ethnicity. I don't think one wants a society in which everyone's trying to outbid everyone else, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I don't think one wants a society in which everyone's trying to outbid everyone else in terms of my grievances are sort of more legitimate than yours necessarily, or I've been more oppressed than even you in the past, because you go down a path where it does become a politics of grievance and anxiety, which I don't think ultimately is, there are legitimate grievances and anxieties, but I think ultimately a politics that is more reasonable, I guess, to use a kind of old-fashioned word, in which people are trying to make appeals to and explain the common good, is actually going to end up being a healthier politics all around, and actually a much healthier politics, I think, especially for those who have historically been discriminated against. I think the politics of power tends to help those who are more powerful.
Let's try and get a couple more in, and then we'll try and wrap up.
My name is Alex Eggman. I'm a junior political science major, and my two questions. Bill Kristol, you've talked about several important lessons that are necessary for ensuring fair public discourse, and I was wondering if you could apply the same, or maybe if there are different special considerations for like the foreign policy realm. And secondly, more specifically, I was wondering if you could apply those to your 2000 neoconservative paper, out of the Project for a New American Century, Rebuilding America's Defenses.
It's a longer discussion about that. I think most of that paper stands up quite well and was very reasonable attempt to say that we needed to be stronger than we were in 2000. We had drawn down too much in terms of defense. We were worried about the threat of terror coming to these shores, and we hadn't dealt very effectively with it in the late 90s. I think that turned out to be correct. And so I don't, that's a separate defense, obviously legitimate debate, an important debate about foreign policy in the post-Cold War world, and I'm happy to have that debate. And there are certainly major ethical concerns and considerations for that. I was a supporter of the war in Iraq, and it didn't go as I hoped it would go, and there's, you know, I think that's a legitimate thing to hold against those of us who supported it, whether we were outside of government or whether we were in government or in Congress at the time, and obviously politically people paid a price for supporting it in a big way. On the other hand, it's also true that I would argue that the surge in Iraq ended up leaving a reasonable situation, as President Obama himself said, at the end of 2008, and I would say the non-intervention in Syria has been an equal moral and at least equal, probably greater moral and humanitarian disaster as the intervention in Iraq. So again, it gets to a sort of partly an ethics of intention, partly a general view of the world and of the importance of sovereignty and the importance of humanitarian intervention and the importance of other kinds of intervention, and then partly to a very serious and hard-headed, if you want, examination of a kind of ethics of consequences, and really what were the consequences, were they anticipated, of intervention, of non-intervention, and what lessons do we take going forward? I think that honestly is a very, a very complicated issue and not an obvious, there's not an obvious right answer in my opinion, going forward for America in terms of intervention, non-intervention, in terms of humanitarian interventions versus other kinds, and so forth. But you know, I think one has to have that debate, as we had that debate in 1999 and 2000.
Hi, thank you for coming here, all four of you. My name is Yasemin. I'm a senior sociology and studio art double major, and I was also actually interested in the idea of civility existing in the same ethics as being pro-war, and think about the civil discourse that can or cannot exist in a state of war where one literally moves soldiers from one continent to the other continent, and like how the two ethics kind of exist in the same space and be right. So if you could like speak, all four of you, if you could like speak a little bit on ethics of war and civility existing in it, that would be appreciated.
So that's also a very complicated question. I mean, the military has actually given a lot of thought to this, and there are tried to adopt policies and practices which minimize, you know, civilian deaths, for example, in war, or at least they say they have, and I think genuinely have tried. But obviously one can quarrel with that and either say the wars in the first place are unjustified, or you can say all wars are justified, you can say some wars are, most wars, some wars are unjustified. And obviously if that's the case, it doesn't do you much good to have, it does some good, but it doesn't do you that much good to be fighting the war in a slightly nicer way than otherwise. If it's unjustified, it's unjustified. But if it's murky, if it's unclear, if some wars do liberate people and stop injustice, stop genocide, and other wars don't, then one has to make a judgment based, I think, to some degree on the facts and on the circumstances. I mean, it really does require, I don't myself, not being a pacifist, think that it's an easy answer in most cases. There's a famous dispute at the beginning of World War II. Gandhi, who was a genuine pacifist, tries to make an argument for why the British, but also the Indians, shouldn't fight the Nazis. I mean, he actually tries to stop the British enlisting the Indians to help the fight against the Nazis and against the Japanese. Orwell, who was a democratic socialist and I think a genuine believer in justice and not some kind of right-winger, certainly a genuine anti-imperialist, had written about that a lot, has a very powerful essay, I believe, where he pays great tribute to Gandhi, incidentally, and to his moral, and this is in a way Carol's point, to his moral clarity and a certain kind of purity almost, but also very much dislikes and disagrees with his understanding of what a moral policy would be in this case. So I think, you know, I'm not just, so it's tougher, it's more extreme in the case of war than all the normal debates we have. But I suppose I would sort of say in the end of the day, it's not that different in kind from the kinds of debates we have about other policies at home or abroad.
Thank you for that really great question. And I think it forces us to ask ourselves a bunch of other questions. To what extent can you be ethical while debating how many lives there are worth how many lives here? And then when you find out the ratio is, I don't know. Can you ever have that conversation ethically? Is all discourse inherently worthwhile, or is some discourse really immoral? The idea that we could somehow, if through rigorous debate and study, get to the proper ratio that justifies the proper war, that puts us in a position where we can once again contemplate how voiceless people have no voice but we will speak for them, is a construct that I find really problematic. As a scholar of power, I find it difficult to divorce this conversation from the one about power, in which some people have the power to discuss what we will do with other people's lives and just, talk about it. Like, let's see, what's the possibilities? And other people have their lives decided for them, and I don't think that that is an acknowledgement that we can make and still consider ourselves to be ethical people. I think that we've been talking about trade-offs. And I think that we're unwilling to make certain trade-offs. For example, we're unwilling to act in an unethical manner, yet admit to it. Like, that's the trade-off. If you're going to do something unethical, you have to be like, yeah, I bear the moral cost for what I just did. I'm going to get repetitive. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, so I guess I'd say there is a kind of tension between most of the sort of virtues that characterize civilized life in war, and that, of course, in war you absolutely do not regard someone as within the scope of reasons, right? That's sort of what's characteristic of war. You treat them as to be moved and quite possibly destroyed in order to achieve some end. And I am also not a pacifist. I think that can be permissible, but I think that the fact that war takes on that fundamentally different stance towards people makes it really, really uniquely serious, right? And maybe certainly doesn't put it beyond trade-offs. I don't know if that's possible, right? But makes it have a sort of uniquely high cost that should make us very reluctant. I think that's about all I have to say about that.
Well, I would just say on that, let's talk about, I was in the White House in 1991-92, the Berlin Wall had come down, Soviet Union collapsed, and war broke out in Yugoslavia. We did nothing, mostly because we were tired, and we won the Cold War, and Bush and Baker didn't really want to get into a war in 92 in an election year, and President Clinton certainly wasn't going to campaign of getting us back into a conflict in Europe and possibly using US troops, and so we did nothing. And there was ethnic cleansing. Because when the powerful US didn't act, it's not like everyone else did nothing. The Serbs ethnically cleansed, the Bosnians, and others actually, and there was some guilt on both sides, obviously, but in this case, I think most of the guilt was on one side. And then we did act. And we acted, I think, correctly and justly, and we acted with real force, and innocent people were killed. We shouldn't kid ourselves about that. And undoubtedly, we didn't fight it in a perfect way. But without the use of force, the ethnic cleansing would have gone on, and the ethnic cleansing would have succeeded, and that would have been the model for the post-Cold War years. So I just think, of course one can't be glib about it, and one can't be facile about it, but one also can't be facile about doing nothing. And one can't be facile about saying, well, we're not in Syria. We're not using our force, our power. We're not trying to presume to tell other people what to do. And 500,000 people have died. Maybe we couldn't have stopped it. Maybe it's not our role to stop that kind of thing from happening everywhere in the world. On the other hand, if you have the power to stop something from happening, I think it's pretty hard to simply rule it out ahead of time. So in that respect, I do weigh the balances probably somewhat differently. I mean, obviously every case requires a serious determination of its own on the merits, but I would say that I'm not as convinced that America in particular has been too fast to go to war instead of too slow often to act. Are we proud that we didn't get into World War II until December 7th, 1941, when we ourselves were attacked? We stayed out of that. We let them work it out over in Europe. Not so sure that was the right decision.
So I think one of the things that, I would agree with Dan that when we're talking about civility and the rules of engagement and acknowledging others as reason givers, that's the realm of speech, that's the realm of politics, that's the realm of discourse, that's the realm of democratic political norms. Once you're at war, those norms are not in play. And it is both naive and disingenuous to pretend that they are, which I think is partly Natalie's point, right? That you can't pretend that, one, that these decisions are easy, or two, that they don't have a huge ethical cost. That I think is that there is an enormous price that is being paid. You yourself are not paying it, and yet you are the one making the decision that it will be paid. And that's a complicated ethical situation for sure. That doesn't mean that the consequences, that you don't also have to think, if you're gonna invoke force, about the consequences of doing or not doing something. That there's a particular, awful responsibility in that regard. That's hard to deny, I think. And that's why, war is bad, and the cost of war is always higher than you think it's gonna be. And sometimes, if you have the ability to stop lots and lots of people from being slaughtered, that's the choice you face. What I find hard is when people pretend like that's not the choice, that there's some easy choice and that it's clear. That's what I think is really awful and unethical to do, or that it's cost-free, or that you're not making a decision and having other people pay the price, which to me is always ethically questionable.
Our last one over here.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Lilly. I'm a freshman, and I was just wondering, to bring it back to Trump and the GOP, just wondering what you guys saw for the future of the Republican Party and the GOP after Trump leaves, whether that be 2019, 2020, 2024, whether that'll be a system of rehabilitation, recovery, how the GOP can bounce back and hopefully, like you said, reestablish that there's two healthy parties as opposed to what we're facing now.
I'm not in the GOP, so I'm going to see that.
No, look, I mean, we don't know. We don't know. It's hard to forecast political developments anyway, but after something so surprising and I think unusual as Trump's takeover, in a sense, of the Republican Party, I mean, I'm not really even making a moral judgment here, actually, an ethical judgment or a value judgment. I'm just analytically, it's very rare in modern American politics for someone to win the nomination of one of the two major parties by really running against that party's most recent standard bearers, that party's most recent presidents. Parties have a certain continuity. They, of course, distance themselves. Bush was a little different from Reagan. Obama was different from John Kerry and so forth. But there's a kind of, usually, the parties respect the previous leaders. And so there's a kind of continuity of policy. What was sort of amazing about 2016, to take 30 seconds of a kind of more political science thing, is, I mean, Sanders ran against the Democratic Party, basically, as corporatist. He criticized even President Obama, who was awfully popular among Democrats. He certainly criticized the Bill Clinton administration on many grounds. And generally, it's a party he hadn't joined, obviously, as a senator. He thought it was much too corporatist, much too indulgent of billionaires and of wealth and of power and a lot of other things. And he got 45% of the vote. Trump ran against the Republican Party. He ran against the wars, the endless wars. He ran against free trade. He ran against moderate policies, let's call it, mostly on immigration, that Bush and McCain, at least, had articulated. And he got actually 45% of the vote, too, on the Republican side, but 45% of the vote in a 16-person field was certainly enough to win the nomination. So the degree to which the public in general was dissatisfied with the elites of both parties is a very interesting fact, and there are lessons to be learned from that. Trump won the nomination, Sanders didn't, and Trump then won the presidency, more, surprising a lot of people. And so here we are. And it's very unclear to me, though, whether it somehow feels like you can't just go back to the status quo ante. That's not how politics works. It's not how life works, usually. And maybe it's unrealistic, even for someone like me, to sort of hope that one could limit the consequences, I put it that way, of Trump and Trumpism within the Republican Party after what we've seen over the last 2 years. For me, that's the big question. Is Trump an inflection point, and we're going down this road for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Or could Trump be kind of a, let's say, parenthesis, kind of something that begins, it had its reasons for happening, it ended. Joe McCarthy. demagogue, late 40s, early 50s, very important U.S. senator, did some damage, undoubtedly, to the country, to innocent individuals especially, did some damage, if you're an anti-communist, to the cause of anti-communism, because he made it less respectable. At the end of the day, it was sort of a parenthesis. I mean, you could write a history of the Cold War or a history of American politics even, I would say, honestly, from 1945 to 1970 or something like that, and you'd have a few pages on Joe McCarthy, and it was not a glorious moment, God knows, in American history, but it was not a fundamental, I wouldn't say, turn in American politics. Is Trump possibly that? Or is it a moment where historians will look back and say, in 2016, one of the two major parties changed, and that has all kinds of possible consequences going forward, which are very hard to work out ahead of time.
It's a good moment for us to wrap. Thank you all for being here this evening. Let's please thank our panel and our guest speaker.